Hello, everyone. Welcome to our presentation. For those of you who haven't attended one of these before, this is who we are. I am Carla Wilkinson. I am a programming librarian at the main library, but I work at all the branches on occasion. And Amber.
I am Amber Lowry, and I work as a reference assistant, predominantly in the local history and genealogy area, but I'm also the type that they say, hey, we need somebody here and you're available, and I go. So
yeah. So this is part 3 of our library history presentation, and both the first and second parts can be found on our YouTube channel if you haven't had a chance to watch those yet. This one, we're covering some of the more controversial topics that we don't normally talk about. So we're calling it Curses, Scandals, Riots, and Controversies. And we're kind of going to go in chronological order. And so first, we're going to talk about the curse. And this curse is cursed ground, specifically where the main library is. And throughout this presentation, we're going to show you cited materials, primary sources. So for this topic, we have a couple of newspaper articles that we've found. And the first one here is from 1957. And Amber, do you want to explain the curse? Because you do a better job at it.
Okay, so the origin of the library curse was that the land that was owned, the land where the current main library is, was owned by a woman named Mrs. Gray. Her husband had passed away, and she did not have any children of her own, or if she did, they had gone from home. And so she had a nephew who was a bit of a ne'er-do-well, and he got into some legal trouble. And so she put the house up as collateral to get a lawyer for him. It did not go well. And when it came time for her to pay up, she had to give up her home. Now, supposedly she left her home very distraught. She had this garden that she loved, and she pointed her finger to the sky and then to the ground and cursed the land and said that everything on this would fail big time. And, you know, it just smacks of a Halloween story, to be quite honest.
It does.
So,
and even though we have this article, and I like the first line, the last 3 librarians to head the Peoria Public Library system have escaped the curse, which has spelled tragedy for nearly half a century. That's referring to the first several librarians, Fred Solden, who by all accounts got pneumonia on a long bike ride. Erastus Wilcox, he's pictured here, he was 85 and deaf and stepped out in front of a streetcar. And then Wiley and Prouse each died kind of suddenly, but there are explanations for their deaths. So I've been another article from 1974 that again talks about the curse. But even though we have newspaper articles, we don't really have a witness to Mrs. Gray standing in her yard yelling at the sky.
I think some of it is they're using a bunch of coincidences, and believe me, I can go with all the conspiracy theories as well. Mm-hmm. But one of the things was that the person who the lawyer who had gotten the house and the land from Mrs. Gray, he met with some misfortune and moved from Peoria. The next couple of families that lived there had some unexpected and early deaths, like infants who died. I believe one of the brides, the guy bought the house, his bride passed away shortly after. Governor Ford lived there for a time, and he had some tragedy, but if you honestly look at historically how people passed, this was not out of the main. I mean, infants
Right.
unfortunately died. Women of childbearing age died. And the two directors after Mr. Wilcox, one was a very robust, passionate man who died of a heart attack after an argument. And the other one may have had some health issues of his own that
Yes.
have come to light. So it was more coincidence than actual curse.
Yeah. It's a good story. But I am happy to say that in recent years, our library directors have been very healthy. So that's the curse, and we're going to move on.
And I'm sure they appreciate that.
Exactly. Yes. Our next topic is the scandal. This is N.C. Doherty and the blown safe. We have a whole scrapbook on this. It's the Doherty scandal.
Two of them.
Two scrapbooks. Oh gosh, yes. So N.C. Doherty, I believe his first name was Newton. He was the superintendent of schools from 1879. And this is related to the library because when the original main library building was built in 1897, they had offices on the first floor that the school board rented. So his office was in the first floor of the main library. He was also president of Peoria National Bank, a well-regarded man, until 1905, when he was charged with embezzlement and forgery in 12 indictments. And I'm going to show you various newspaper articles from the scrapbooks. So over here on the left is something that kind of explains generally how he did this. And so in the bottom left-hand corner in the red box, you can see that teachers' payrolls were stuffed in amounts ranging from $25,000 to $40,000 a year. Repairs on city schools averaging from $22,000 to $32,000 per year returned for the past 3 years. And these sums are said to be over double the correct amounts. In other parts of this article, it says that coal bills were double the figures. He basically just padded his accounts and just doubled everything, and he kept the excess.
Well, and you said he, when we read through this, he would make up employees.
Yes, that's right. He would make up timesheets, pay slips for employees, and he would make up names of teachers so that it looked like someone was in that position. And you'll see the late Mrs. Ting was used as his dupe. Mrs. Ting is a famous Peorian. She was the treasurer of the school board. And she trusted him and probably should not have. In all, he embezzled over $541,000. And that's not in today's money. That's in 1900 money, which would be probably over $14 million today. And this started right away within 6 months of his appointment to the role in 1879.
So he did this for almost 20 years.
He did, yeah. So on the right-hand side, you'll notice this article is from 1907. So this is 2 years after he was indicted. The safe in the school offices was blown in the library on January 6, 1907, and some records were stolen that could have been incriminating to him. And they believed that the records were burned in the library boiler in the furnace, but they actually think that that was just a distraction, that they weren't really burned. It was something else that was burned, and they took some money as well.
95 whole dollars.
Well, that would be a lot today. Then he pled guilty. He was tried on 5 of the indictments. He pled guilty, and he was sentenced to 1 to 14 years in the state prison in Joliet, which seems like an odd time period for imprisonment, 1 to 14 years. And I really like this cartoon on the right-hand side. This is from a Chicago paper, and it shows the crooked way or the straight path, implying that Doherty took the crooked way. So the safe, the blowing of the safe was investigated. In the meantime, Doherty was paroled after just 5 years in prison, and I think he ended up out in Colorado, and who knows what happened to him. He probably, I find it hard to believe that he didn't go back to some of his
I think he was kind of
ways.
revered wherever he went.
Yeah. Which
I think we have his obituary in towards the end of these books or something like that. And I know he's on Find a Grave, or he was at one time. I think what I've read, he kind of maybe went on the straight and narrow, or he duped a whole bunch more people.
Yeah. So they arrested this famous safe blower, which it's just funny that that was something you could be known for. But 1907, Eddie Tate was famous for cracking safes, and they arrested him. They thought that he had done it, and I think he even confessed to it. He said, "Oh yeah, I did that." And he was in jail in Peoria, and he tricked a guard basically into letting him out, and he escaped. He was arrested in New York and brought to Chicago, but he was not returned to Peoria because they eventually believed that he fabricated his confession. So I don't think they ever really knew who blew the safe. Our next topic, third out of four, is the riot, and this is where we're going to be talking about Matt Hale. And I think pretty much everyone is familiar with who Matt Hale is, the leader, so-called leader of a white supremacist group who was from East Peoria, went to Bradley. He, in 1990, requested the use of a meeting room at the main library. And at the time, library director Maggie Gibbs, it appears, got a lot of questions from staff and said, we don't want to let this guy use our rooms because we don't like what he stands for. And so she contacted the city attorney and asked if the library had to allow him to use the room. And so on the left is a letter from David Thomas, the city attorney. And it's basically saying, I've seen the application. It's my opinion that the library's policy of providing meeting rooms to members of the public, this would be violating his First Amendment rights if you didn't allow him to use the room, because nothing in his application says that he's going to violate your policy. And so on the right is a memo that went out to staff in February of 1990 saying he gets to use the auditorium on February 24th. And here's the letter. And if anything happens, you should call the police. And I don't know that anything happened at this time. However, in 2001, Matt Hale held a meeting in the auditorium of the main library that turned into a riot, a brawl. If you so choose, there is a video somewhere on the internet of this brawl in the auditorium. People were throwing chairs. I believe what happened is that some people came to protest his group, and it erupted into a violent brawl. And I've heard staff members who were there at the time saying that there was pepper spray being used, and police had to use all sorts of different tactics to break up the brawl. And you see these are headlines from the Journal-Star from that time, that the library then reviewed their meeting room policy about what do we do here. Hale apparently said he didn't want to pay the library fine, and he was barred from using the rooms. And then the library changed their security policy, saying that if some sort of security detail or someone was needed, that the user would have to pay a fee. And we don't have anything on our current library policy about needing extra security. The only time we would do that is if it was, say, an after hours event. We've done some for the public schools, where we just have our security guards stay later. but thankfully we've not had anything like this happen. And Matt Hale, of course, is in prison now, so we aren't going to worry about him wanting to come back.
Well, and I know part of this, I remember it was a big deal at the time. Because I wasn't at the library yet, but I vaguely recall reading something about the library wanted to put in place an insurance policy. These groups would have to have an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
And that didn't look so good for us because, we have a lot of groups that meet that can't meet anywhere else because they don't have money, let alone an insurance policy.
Mm-hmm.
And so
as a public entity, I'm not sure that we could require something like that.
I think that's what it came down to. I think we looked into it, but it really caused an issue. I remember reading about it in the paper.
But saying that he's barred from using the facility, we are also stewards of the library buildings for the public. We have to take care of the buildings for the public. And as part of that, we need to protect the buildings from groups that have proven that they're not going to respect them. So that's what happened in this case in a very large way. Okay, now we're going to move on to the meaty part of the presentation. This is probably what we'll spend the most of our, well, it is what we'll spend the most of our time on. We're going to talk about Lincoln Branch and the city cemetery. And, in 2009, the Lincoln Branch was expanded, and we're going to talk about that. But we're going to start from the beginning and talk about the history of the city cemetery in that location. We're going to show you, again, primary source materials and do the best job that we can in trying to interpret all of this information for you. Because it is kind of a tricky story to understand. So the origin of this public graveyard was that in November 5th, 1839, a man named G.C. Dana sold 5 acres to trustees of the town of Peoria. It was a town at that time. I'm not sure, what year was it a city, Amber?
That came much later. I don't remember off the top of my head.
Like 1845, maybe. It was actually
like
a city. So $230 the city paid G.C. Dana for this land for a public graveyard. And the graveyard was not platted until February of 1842. They divided it up into 368 lots. They were first sold by auction, then at an appraised price. And I'm assuming this was the purpose of the auction was to give people the chance to get their prime spot first. And after that, you could just buy whichever spot was left at the appraised price. And it was described that it was uncontestable and ownership is to be forever. So here is from the Peoria Democratic Press. On the left is proceedings of the city council saying that they have established this burial ground. And on the right, also from the Peoria Democratic Press, in Peoria, the want of a public burial place has added to the affliction of those who have been so unfortunate as to be bereft of relatives or friends, and the remains of many have been temporarily interred with an intention of removal when a public cemetery should be provided. An opportunity is now afforded of doing so, and to all our citizens to procure a family burial plat in a tract of land owned by the town and specially dedicated to that use. So what I want to point out in this is that remains had been temporarily interred, which means that since there was no public cemetery, people were burying their deceased, maybe in the backyard, maybe anywhere. So this was to give a dedicated spot for people to bury their loved ones.
But you have to wonder if they kept good records of that at all, because there are no Undertaker records for that time frame. There are no death records for that time frame. There are no coroner records for that time frame. So if they said, "Oh yeah, we buried these 10 people somewhere around here,"
right? Yeah. Who
Only
knows?
9 of them.
So here is that plat, the 1842. This is a recreation. This is not the original plat map. But the city ordinance on the right said, be it further ordained by the authority aforesaid that so much of said ground on the east and south sides thereof, as it is laid out in ranges, shall be reserved for and appropriated to the burial of poor persons and strangers who may not have other ground provided for them. So that's these long sections on the right and on the bottom. Looks like there's one question. Was the cemetery segregated? Wayne Cannon,
not that we're aware of,
asking, was the cemetery segregated? We don't know, Wayne. And part of the reason for that is, and we'll talk about this later, we don't have any records for the cemeteries. We don't actually know who was buried there, but we have no indication that it was segregated. We also want to give you some background on why there might have been a great need for a cemetery. Cholera came through in waves, and we have several things that talk about it. On the left is an excerpt from a book, Peoria City and County, Illinois. It's a history book published in 1912. And I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but basically in 1849, according to this book, there were so many cases of cholera that they decided to use the courthouse as a hospital, 3 upper rooms in the courthouse. The county furnished beds, necessary medicines, and they gave someone a special contract to furnish coal for the courthouse. And it even says that at this time, William Mitchell was clerk, but before the next session of the court held in November following, he fell a victim of cholera. So in 1849, there was apparently a lot of cholera going through town. On the right is an article from the Democratic Press in 1850. And I know it's kind of blurry and hard to read, but it basically says, a lot of people have said there's a lot of cholera, and we just want to let you know that there isn't cholera here right now. We will be the first ones to let you know if there is cholera. So it's something that people were worried about.
Kind of sounds like a pandemic to me.
It does, yeah. Here's an 1854 map, and I want to orient you. On the left, in the red square with an arrow pointing at it, that's where the city cemetery was. And the yellow star is showing you Main and Monroe Street, where the main library is now, just to give you some pinpoint, give you some orientation there. And you'll see that the cemetery is basically on the edge of town. There are streets laid out on 2 sides of the cemetery, but the other 2 sides of the cemetery are open land, it appears.
Not only that, this is about the time that Springdale was being conceived, but what also you can't see on this map is just, so that map, the north would be to the right side. The Catholic cemetery existed at that time along the riverfront, and that was off the edge of the map there too.
Yeah, let me go back up to that. Yeah, so over off to the right would have been the Catholic cemetery. And like this, let's see, this road, can you see my mouse? This road here would be Knoxville, and kind of the fuzzy furry line here would be the River Bluff. So as Amber was saying, yes, in 1857, internments began at Springdale Cemetery, and people started voluntarily moving their deceased loved ones to Springdale. Governor Thomas Ford, who we mentioned earlier, he died in 1850 and was buried at the city cemetery, and in 1860, he was moved to Springdale. So this is his monument, which is now at Springdale. And this was part of the rural cemetery movement. Amber, can you explain the rural cemetery movement?
Sure. The rural cemetery movement had started around about the 1850s. And the idea was, obviously, you didn't want you had these cities growing up around these small city cemeteries that had been created. So the idea was to get a piece of land, a big piece of land outside of the city, and create a place that was not only a place to bury your dead, but also kind of in combination with a parkland. Keep in mind, at this time, we did not have like city parks like we do today. So it was kind of a twofold thing. Here's this beautiful land. The mentality around death and cemeteries was changing. The idea was you would maybe go and have a picnic in your family burial plot, to spend time with your ancestors. I can't say I haven't done it. It is kind of interesting to do, but it was a way to create a dedicated space, and a lot of them are on edges of towns, just so that you couldn't build around it. In fact, one of the most famous, one of the first, is a very famous cemetery in France, and the name is blanking on me at the moment, but I know if I said it, people go, "Oh, yeah, that one."
It's
but
Jim Morrison is buried.
Yeah, so it's a very dedicated movement to have new places, rather than these small, little boxed in, no room for growth cemeteries.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So in 1860, this is just 6 years after that last map, you can see now the city cemetery is surrounded by streets. The city is growing. And on the right-hand side, marked on the map, it says to Springdale Cemetery. So it was important enough at that time that it was marked on this city map. And again, just to the right along the river was it St. Mary's, the Catholic cemetery?
It was the original St. Mary's.
Yes, and that's, we believe, approximately where Komatsu is now, on the river. Okay, 1864, the city cemetery was getting very full. And Griswold and Company owned land on the south and west sides of the cemetery, and they offered to sell them for $150 a lot, which would be $800 cash. And this was opposed. The city said we should look for something cheaper. So that didn't go well.
Yeah, Griswold got greedy.
Yes. So here is a map that shows you this land. You can see on the west and the south sides of the cemetery, this land owned by Griswold. That is now residential. The city did not buy that land, and there are streets through there.
Where it says Plank Road, that is actually Lincoln now.
Yes, Lincoln Avenue was called Plank Road at the time. And some of these other street names have changed. Louisa Street is still there, but Eliza, I think, is Sumner now. I'm not sure what Charlotte and Warren are now. In 1864, this is from the Peoria Daily Transcript, City Council proceedings, saying that they authorized repairs of a gate, trimming up shrubbery, fixing up headstones, etc. So that tells us that it was getting kind of run down. That they
only 20 years later.
Yeah, only 22 years after it was platted, they had to authorize trimming up shrubbery. And they did employ a sexton. So, it seems like someone should have been taking care of it, but it was kind of being neglected. In 1874, the state of Illinois came out with these revised statutes, and we are most interested in section number 2 here, which is when a cemetery may be removed and who is in charge of the expenses. And it says that whenever any cemetery shall be embraced within the limits of any town or city, it shall be lawful for the corporate authorities thereof, if in their opinion any good cause exists why such cemetery should be removed, to cause the remains of all persons interred therein to be removed to some other suitable place. It doesn't say that you have to move your cemetery if it is completely surrounded by the limits of city or town, but it says you can. And so you can interpret this how you will, but this gave the city the authority to remove the cemetery. It goes on to say that private individuals would have been in charge of the expense of that, and that the city could not do it without permission of whoever owned the plot. So by 1877, there's increasing pressure. Citizens who live in that area say the city is growing fast, the cemetery is coming within the city limits. Cemetery is so crowded that the dead are being buried on the dead. So even though there was a sexton, people would do their own burials. And it might have been simple as, well, I own this plot of land, I'm just going to dig a hole and do it myself. We don't know. We don't know what was in the minds of these people.
I also have to wonder, records-wise.
Right. No one was keeping records of these.
They said, yeah, a lot of headstones were not by today's standards. So, it may have just been a rock over the top, or where they thought the top was, or a wooden cross, something that wasn't exactly perhaps where it may have been buried. So they're guessing,
right?
Yeah.
On the right, 1881. So this is 39 years after the cemetery was platted. It says, for years it has been practically abandoned. I therefore suggest that steps be taken for the discontinuance of the same, doing nothing, however, that would impair the city's title to the same. The city is rapidly building up in that vicinity, and the existence of the cemetery, as it is, has a tendency to retard growth in that direction. So people are, we have accounts of people telling their aldermen, look, this is an eyesore. No one wants to live here. You need to do something about it. So they started talking about turning it into a park. In March of 1882, Alderman McLean moved that the matter of transforming the city cemetery into a public park be referred to the Committee on Public Grounds and City Property. And they wanted an estimate of the cost of exhuming the bodies, and also the cost of quieting all claims of private parties owning lots therein, and also the cost of making it a public park. So this was not a movement to turn it into a park, but let's start gathering information. So just over a couple weeks later, they made a motion that $600 be appropriated for exhuming bodies in the old city cemetery and fixing it up as a park. And that motion carried. So at this point, they have set aside $600 to transform it from a cemetery into a park.
And keep in mind, a lot of burials had been removed at this point.
And perhaps they didn't know how many had been removed. But also, isn't it true, Amber, that people would do that themselves? Like they would go, instead of paying someone to do it, because I think we read some accounts where there were holes left in the ground because people had moved their loved ones.
And I'm sure rules were kind of different. Maybe they had to leave the hole open to show that they had vacated it. And, keep in mind, this is kind of abandoned at this point. So, a lot of shoddy record keeping.
Yes. Yeah. So, and here we have gone a whole year now with nothing really happening. We get to March of 1883, and there is a resolution for the vacation of the old city cemetery and to provide for the removals of the bodies there interred under certain conditions. There was considerable discussion as to the best course to pursue, and it was referred to the Committee on Public Grounds. So 2 weeks later, the Committee on Public Grounds came back and said that there were about 600 bodies buried in the cemetery, which can and should be removed. recommending for the purpose of purchasing sufficient and suitable grounds to which the remains shall be removed, an appropriation of $2,500. And also turning it into a park. And $2,500 in 1883 would be about $50,000 today. And this was just a report. This was no official motion.
You realize that they think it would cost $4
Mm-hmm.
per body.
Right, yeah. So I don't know how they came up with that amount. We don't know what happened beyond what was reported in the newspaper. So the next thing we have is over a year later, 1884, and it just says that the city rejected allowing ground to be used for a street.
I think this was actually Griswold decided he wanted a street. And
Griswold wanted a street to his land.
Yeah, and but he didn't want it to go on his land. He wanted it to go through the city cemetery, and the city cemetery, or the city's like, no.
Yeah, I think we read something. There was another place where it said that the city rejected this, stating that there were many bodies there and they could not put a street there.
Yeah.
Also, we left this part in just below that. The Committee on Finance reported that the public library building was not exempt from taxation and refused to refund taxes levied as prayed for in petition. So we just thought that was kind of funny that here in our research of the city cemetery, we came across the library. So the next thing we have is February of 1885. And it is just simply, it is proposed to convert the old city cemetery on the Plank Road into a park to be known as Lincoln Avenue Park. And on the right, in the same newspaper, the same city council proceedings, we have a budget featuring Lincoln Avenue Park and saying that they are going to set aside $500 for the upkeep of this park. So we don't know what happened between 1884 and 1885. We can only hope that they tried to find family members of the people who were buried there, but we just don't know. And so they just simply proposed to convert it to a park, and it became a park. The last thing we do know about people who were buried there is the Besseman family. We know that remains were moved from Lincoln Park to Springdale Cemetery in 1902. The Bessemans were German immigrants. It was 5 children.
It was a husband and wife, and they had 3 living children and
a niece.
Mrs. Besseman's niece, and yes. They were on the river on a boat, and a tornado came through, and I believe this was 1858, 57, something like that. And if you read the newspapers for that time, it was comparable to the Washington tornado. It came through town and it ripped a bunch of stuff up, and this family was drowned in the river. Mr. Besseman was the only one to survive, and that was by chance. He was hanging on to a rock or a log or something like that, and somebody had gone out in a boat to look for somebody else and found him. I think had he known his family had not made it, he may not have made it himself. But his 3 sons were all drowned, as well as his wife and his adopted daughter, his wife's niece. And when we look at the information from Springdale Records, from the looks of it, not only were those 5 sets of remains removed at the time, but there's also evidence there was 2 other sons that they had that had predeceased this family, and they were all moved in 1902. The thing is we don't know why they waited until 1902. There is not really documentation. I would call it more anecdotal, but there is information out there published that says that she absolutely refused to let him move his family.
This was his second wife.
his second wife. After his family passed away, he went back to Germany for a few years. And when he returned to Peoria, he was remarried and had a daughter. He ended up having, I believe, 4 children with his second wife. And when he wanted to move his family to a different cemetery, she refused.
And then didn't he die and he was buried in the city cemetery?
He died and he was buried in the city cemetery for about 30 years before, for whatever reason, from what I can tell, it wasn't another family member who passed that she felt the need to do this. If there was public pressure from the city, there wasn't anything in the paper. Keep in mind, our newspapers are not digitized and they're not indexed. So trying to find something from 1902 is quite honestly a needle in a haystack.
Right.
We would have had to get really lucky to find out why. There is no confirmed information as to why she decided in 1902 suddenly to remove those remains. My personal speculation is in 1903, they started doing sewer projects in that area. So it's quite possible the city went to her and said, okay, you don't want to move these, that's fine. But we're going to be doing the sewer project. So you can move them or we will move them. And, perhaps she didn't understand that the city was going to be responsible for it. She didn't have the money. We just don't know.
That's right. Yeah. So as far as we know, this is the last documented removal from the city cemetery to anywhere, Springdale or anywhere else. Okay. So how did it become a library from a park? In the 1909 library annual report, it mentions that there's a new branch library, Lincoln Branch, and it's opened in some rooms in the newly erected manual training high school. So this was the first recorded branch of the public library. They had been doing outreach in schools and hospitals up to this point, but they didn't have a permanent location. In 1909, also, Henry Means Pindell, who owned and was the publisher of the Peoria Journal, he was also a board member for the public library, was recruited by the board to contact Andrew Carnegie and see if Carnegie would fund a branch library. Carnegie had made his fortune in steel, of course, and was granting money to communities all over the United States to build libraries. And there is a great website for the Carnegie Foundation where you can look up any Carnegie library in the nation and find digitized all of the documentation for that library. So we were able to download all of the letters that went back and forth between Henry Pindell and Carnegie's private secretary. And it sounds like Carnegie himself made these decisions. So it wasn't the secretary or, he didn't have a separate department of people working on the libraries. Carnegie himself was making these decisions. So on the right, we have the first letter from Pindell to Andrew Carnegie saying, I've been asked to request help in constructing a branch library. And he describes the city and why they would need this branch. And so Carnegie's private secretary starts communicating back and forth with Henry Pindell. And eventually, in December of 1909, Pindell gets this letter confirming that Carnegie is offering $20,000 to erect the branch library. And when Carnegie offered a sum of money, the condition was that the city had to be able to provide 10% of that every year for the upkeep of the library, and that they had to provide a suitable location for the library. So the conditions were that the city needed to provide not less than $2,000 a year and a suitable site, and that Carnegie would give the $20,000. So here are letters from Pindell to Carnegie's private secretary. The one on the left says it will take some time to arrange for the ground, but I'm sure we can get this done. I'll let you know. And on the right, it says I am enclosing a certified copy of the council proceedings passed last Tuesday night, covering the location of the library. And he says it is in the center of Lincoln Park, which is in the very heart of the thickly populated working men's district of the city and is an ideal location. And here are the city council proceedings that named Lincoln Park an ideal location for said library building, and also said that nothing can be done to disturb two lots where there are injunctions. In the bottom half of this, we do know of these two lots, one Harriman Couch and one Helen McPhail. And these are lots where these people said, no, we are not moving our loved ones. And they got an injunction through the court. And so those injunctions stand today. And we know that there are certain places, certain plots of land that we cannot disturb at all. And we respect that. So then we have November of 1910. The Peoria Herald transcript had this headline: "Workmen unearth bones in old Indian cemetery. Carnegie Library site in Lincoln Park turns up skeletons, queer relics, and old garments." So what this tells me is that nearly 60 years after the cemetery was established, perhaps I have a couple of different ideas here. Either there weren't a lot of people left around who knew the history of this cemetery, who knew that it had been the public city cemetery. And so they really did think that it was an Indian cemetery because they had no clue that it had been a public cemetery. Or the city was telling people that it was an Indian cemetery because they were trying to cover it up. Now, we have no real proof of any sort of cover up happening here. And we know that the late 1800s were a time when people were pretty transient. Of course, there are families who stayed where they were, established a home in one place and never left Peoria, but there were also people who did leave and move on out west.
No, that was like not a dig at me, right?
No, that was not a dig at your family nor mine. But I believe in this article, it says something like the leg bone was so long that the person had to have been over 7 feet tall and it could have only been an Indian. And I'm not exactly sure how they came to that conclusion. But we do know that in building the library, they did dig up some remains.
You know, I stick by my statements that I've said to people. You cannot convince me that there is a single inch of this earth where some human remains haven't been buried.
Yeah.
I mean, people have been around for a very, very, very long time.
Mm-hmm.
It is possible, I suppose, at some point that it was a burial ground for natives prior.
But I also think that if you start digging a hole, you're not going to come across the native bones first.
Yeah. No, I honestly think it was either an accidental thing or, like you said, maybe a spin to make it a bit more positive, or truly just somebody who's bad at reporting.
Yeah.
You know?
The next one we have is that schoolboys were using a skull for a ball. Evidently, they were playing soccer or something with it. And I think it was an alderman or someone paid them 10 cents and took the skull. And we're not exactly sure what they did with it.
Hey, maybe that's the skull we had in the library.
Yeah, I wonder. Yeah, we'll hope not. So here is, I just really like this drawing. This is the architect plans for the Lincoln branch. A pretty typical Carnegie building, but unique in its own way. No two Carnegie buildings were alike. In reading the correspondence between Pindell and Carnegie's secretary, it sounds like Carnegie had final approval of the plans. He was very personally involved in every single library and wanted them to look a certain way. So this is the Lincoln branch. That is what used to be the front. It's still there, but the entrance is in a different place. And the architects were Hotchkiss and Harris. So in the 1911 annual report, the library had been opened, and the paragraph I've highlighted there says that the city gave the site one of the choicest in the whole city, in the center of the large open space planted with shade trees known as Lincoln Park on Lincoln Avenue in the lower end of our city. So nothing mentioned about a cemetery. And here is Lincoln Branch 6 days before its grand opening. So we've jumped way ahead because we don't know of anything to do with the cemetery or anything really controversial between when it opened and 1970. And in 1970, they were considering closing the library, moving it somewhere actually smaller, because at that time the library was not being used very much. Circulation and just general door count numbers are very low, and so they were considering moving it to a smaller location. Kathleen Powers Deitwig lived in the area and loved the library and did not like the idea of it being moved, and so she started a petition. And it says, housewife's protest, which I'm sure she was more than just a housewife. And that is her in front of the Lincoln branch. These are not very good screen captures from microfilm, but that's the best we have. And so Mrs. Deitwig had this petition going around and saved the library. And she is one of our honorees in the Lincoln Branch Hall of Fame. I think she was the first honoree in that Hall of Fame at the Lincoln Branch. I see a question. Did she live across from Commonplace? Oh boy, Roberta, are you there?
Yeah, Roberta's.
I don't know, Wayne. This is a Roberta question. So we'll wait and see if Roberta can answer that for us. Let's see. Yes, she did. Okay.
Thanks, Roberta.
Thank you, Roberta. When in doubt, ask Roberta. The next thing in 1992, Henry Pindell Slane, grandson of Henry Means Pindell, donated $500,000 to the Lincoln branch. And that is very neat to us because it was his grandfather who did the work in corresponding with Carnegie to try to get the Lincoln branch there. So that's just a really neat little fact. And I think Henry Slane is maybe also in the Lincoln Branch Hall of Fame. Okay. In 1989, the state of Illinois passed the Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act. So 1989, 32 years ago, well over 100 years after the Lincoln City Cemetery closed. And this said that all unregistered graves, grave artifacts, grave markers that are over 100 years old and are not located in a cemetery that is registered are protected. And it protects them from disturbances. And it goes on in more detail. But basically, up until 1989, there was nothing to protect the city cemetery in Lincoln Park. There were no laws that were violated because there were no laws. That doesn't mean it was right. That doesn't mean that we agree with it, but there was nothing to protect it. So
the problem is we occasionally get stories, especially at the library, especially in local history and genealogy, and there are some printed anecdotes that talk about various former cemeteries of remains being removed and dumped, or being put into boxes and buried in a communal paupers pit, stuff like that. The problem is there are no facts. It's usually based on somebody's commentary. I heard that, and that's how like urban legends happen.
It's a lot of family lore and urban legend. Yeah. So, but this act is very important to what we did in 2009, and this is what guided our actions then. So in 2007, the city passed a referendum to remodel all the existing library buildings, add a branch building, and expand Lincoln Branch. And so the library, knowing that that land had been a city cemetery, proactively hired the Midwest Archaeological Research Services Incorporated, also known as MARS, to investigate the impact of the proposed expansion at Lincoln Branch on any human remains and associated grave goods contained therein. Knowing that if they just started digging a foundation and came across anything, they would have to halt construction, they proactively hired this archaeological firm to go in and figure out what the impact of this expansion would be. So the preliminary work that Mars did was background research. They looked for any existing deeds that they could find to cemetery plots. They looked at township plats. They studied the expansion plans for the building, and they tried to locate cemetery records. They submitted a preliminary report that talked about the relationship between the cemetery and the library, where it was located within the cemetery. And they mapped the location of burials that they knew had been removed to Springdale Cemetery, because Springdale Cemetery has very good records. And so they then came up with this data recovery plan. So this was their plan for, here is what we are going to do. Remove all human remains and associated grave artifacts within the area of potential impact in a respectful manner according to the Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act and the Act's implementing regulations. I attempt to identify the burial population and the identity of individual burials. Attempt to identify and contact next of kin, and that the library would be financially responsible for the curation of the excavated remains and artifacts at the Illinois State Museum, or reburial in an appropriate cemetery as directed by the Illinois Historic Preservation Agency in consultation with the next of kin. So this was the plan, a very detailed, fully written out plan before they did anything. They researched for several months ahead of time and had this plan all ready to go before they did anything at the site. So in June of 2009, June 8th, work began, and it was estimated that it would last about 21 weeks. And the map on the right is a rough sketch of where they planned to work. So the staging area in the bottom left-hand corner, they did not need to dig there at all. That would not be impacted by the building. They had a rough outline of where the expansion would be. And then they also, I believe, and someone can correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Barry, Roberta, they also originally maybe wanted to do something with the parking area, or they could leave it as it was. So that was the rough plan of where they were going to excavate. So this is a neat map of the existing building in the center, that square with the little piece jutting out in the front. And then that fan-shaped part was the proposed expansion. And this is overlaid on top of the cemetery plat, so you can see the impacted areas. And I will point out the bottom left part of the proposed expansion has a notch out of it. And that is because of the area of injunction for the Harriman couch plots. And also the bottom part of that fan area touches those basically public lots, the lots set aside for the poor and strangers. And then the green part was carriage paths, roads in the cemetery. And so that was where they assumed they would not find anything. And they didn't really know what they would find, but they were pretty sure they would find something. So here is day one. And what they did is they had a backhoe with a bucket that did not have teeth on it. It was a smooth backhoe, so that it just very smoothly pulled the dirt away. And they dug down just a few feet so that they could see the dirt, but not actually get down and disturb anything. And you can see outlines of disturbed earth. And they didn't know exactly what was under there. Not until they dug down further, they didn't know if those were vacated burial plots or if there were remains still in them. But you can see the dark rectangles. And that was because when you dug a grave, you were mixing dirt up with other kinds of dirt. And so you were changing the color of the dirt. And so when you put it back in, it would not match the dirt surrounding it. So it's really easy to see the different colors and to see the outlines of the burial features. So this was the first day. They actually started the furthest away, all the way out, so that they would know right away if they needed to consider decreasing the footprint of the addition. Also on the first day, they found this. They believe that this was the base of an obelisk for Governor Thomas Ford. Governor Ford was flat broke when he died. He did not have a penny to his name, so he was buried in one of those lots set aside for the poor.
Well, and he was kind of involved. If you remember in the beginning, it was presumed he was affected by the curse because he was living in the Mrs. Gray house.
Yes, he was renting it.
Yes, and so his original headstone, which was an obelisk, not like what's currently in the cemetery. This edition that we have here from the newspaper, we presume it to be what the Ford Monument originally looked like. We know that it was very large. It was done by Mr. Jewell, but we also know that it was damaged. And I believe it was in the same tornado that took the lives of the Besseman family.
Yes.
So it was damaged, and I think they attempted to repair it somewhat, but when they moved him a couple of years later, there was some complaint that this man who had been a great governor had a really terrible marker because it had been damaged. So it was replaced in the late 1890s with what's currently there.
Yes. So Thomas Ford had been moved in 1860. So they knew he wasn't there, but they believe, because they know approximately which plot he had been in the city cemetery, they assumed that this brick base was for his monument.
Which would have been a lot in a poor section. They wouldn't have been a large base like that in the poor section.
Yes.
A lot of those would have been unmarked.
Correct. Yeah. This is just another picture to illustrate to you what they found when they did that initial excavation. And you'll notice some round holes. And those could have been post holes for a fence or a hitching post or a grave marker or something like that. So you can see the different types of features that they found as they started excavating. And you'll also see the letterboard, signboard, I don't know what the official name for that is, that every time they found a burial feature, they gave it a number and they took lots of pictures of it. And those are all documented. And everything is very, very well documented. This just gives you an idea of the scope of the project. That here we are at the sidewalk at the back of the land, and you can see the rear of the building, the library building there. You can see just the size of this project that they did. This is an interesting picture. You can see that the lines that they've marked here for the burial features are not parallel. They're kind of slanted, they're kind of offset. They believe that some of these burials were illegal, that people did them themselves. That in one of those newspaper articles, someone said, people are burying the dead on top of the dead. So this could have been one of those cases. And so that makes it even more difficult to know who was buried there, because if it was done illegally, there is no record that's likely to ever be found. Here's an example of the detail to which they went in their excavation, that they're sifting through every shovelful of soil that came out of the ground. And on the right, those little objects in that person's hand are upholstery tacks that would have come out of a coffin. And they're going to go in that bag that's labeled with the number of the burial feature from which it came. So they're saving everything. And every single item is going to help them identify the year that person was buried and help them narrow down a time frame. So that's why they're keeping those. And the whole report is very detailed, and they talk about different styles of upholstery tacks that were common and when they were produced and how that helps them pinpoint a date for that burial. Here are some other things that help them in establishing dates. On the left, you can see kind of a sunken coffin with some decorative metal pieces. And on the right is a handle. So they researched different styles of handles, different handle producers. And so they knew what was common and what year those were produced. So that helped them as well. And they kept every bit of this. So what did they find? You can see here all of these burial features that they found. And you'll see the black fan-shaped outline of the original proposed edition. And then the red rectangle is the smaller edition that we ended up with. And that was because of all of the burial features on the right and on the bottom and on the left that you can see that it just would have been very, very expensive. And it would have disturbed a lot of these graves if we were to excavate all of those. You'll also see in the bottom left-hand corner, it points out where that brick monument was. And also on the left-hand side, it's pointing out the area of injunction where we know the couch graves are. So I'm going to give you a couple of examples of the reports that they did on these burial features. On the top is number 217, and that kind of, what is that, a rhombus? I don't know, it's not a square. That is number 80, A, B, and C, and we're going to talk about 80C. So 80C, they did two things. They did a burial feature inventory and a skeletal analysis. So the inventory is, what did we find? It goes through, and they think it was an adult female, the same pit, they're calling it, as two other adults. And the part that I've underlined is that during removal, the sexton failed to recover the complete body. So what we can infer from this is that this grave was moved at some point. The sexton moved this, and maybe this person went to Springdale or another cemetery. But if you look closely, they left behind a right scapula and humerus along with hair mass. So this was not done very well. There were no teeth recovered. From the few pieces that were left behind, they know that it was an adult, and to the best of their knowledge, they can assume that it was female. But they know nothing else about who was buried there. Now we have number 217, much more detailed. They know that number 217 was a male over 50 years old. They can tell you how tall he was. Associated artifacts, there was a safety pin on the right tibia, a straight pin, a shell button, 3 ceramic buttons on the left ilium. The individual had dental cavities, gum disease, healed fractures on the left lower leg, a mild depression fracture of the skull, and degenerative joint disease. He was between 5'9" and 5'11", and a lot of details. And all of this work was not done outside at Lincoln Branch. This was done later at a different facility. So you can see the degrees to which they were able to analyze the different burial features. The demographics that they discovered, you'll see that over 50% of the individuals that were buried there, or just of the ones that they excavated, over 50% were 5 years or younger. And then there's also a large number of females in the 20 to 35 year range. And what that tells us is that life was particularly hard for childbearing women and infants at this time. The pathological findings. This is just, to me, this is kind of fascinating. And this is how they would try to figure out who these people were and why they were there. And so I wanted to just explain some of these definitions for you. Trauma most often means fractures, but not necessarily cause of death. Like, it could have been that you broke your arm when you were in the 3rd grade and now you're an adult, but we can still tell from your bones that you broke your arm. Joint alteration is generally attributed to arthritis, but 7 of the individuals had a degenerative joint disease, maybe like arthritis or something more serious than that. Periosteal reaction is porous bone growth. They only analyze this in individuals under 3 years of age, and it can be triggered by inflammation or infection. And 3 of these individuals seem to have a reaction that's associated with trauma. So they didn't necessarily name a cause of death, but they're trying to figure out, how did these people live? Why did they die? Parodic hyperostosis is a change in the bone, usually meaning small holes. Porous, parodic. The presence in infant and juvenile remains can indicate scurvy, so lack of vitamins, but they can't prove it without researching further, doing more tests. Caries, periodontitis, and enamel hypoplasias are all dental disease, and that can indicate poor dental hygiene. Enamel hypoplasias in adults can indicate a difficult childhood. So in all, we can say that for sure this was a rough time to live. Probably especially if you were a small child or a childbearing woman. So the summary of the findings: overall, they exposed 304 burial features. Once they decreased the footprint of the expansion, they only had to excavate 86 of those burial features. They found 88 sets of human remains. So do the math there. 86 features, 88 sets of remains, plus 12 were empty, meaning no remains were present. So they had people buried with one another. And this could have been a child buried with a mother, or children buried together, or something like that. But again, I think this can contribute to the lack of proper documentation. So stewardship, what do we have to do now? So Mars mapped and labeled all the features that were not excavated. They also described that they put some metal tags down under that layer, that first layer that they scraped off. They put metal tags down there and wrote the number on them. They assumed that the number will fade over time, but the metal can be found with a metal detector. So should anyone need to dig in there, say an electric line or a sewer line or something breaks and we have to dig, we can find things now in that area. that was uncovered. The exposed features were then covered with plastic sheeting and clean fill, and they made sure not to drive over them as they were covering them. The contractors, with the help of Mars, installed shoring where the proposed walls of the library addition came close to unexcavated features. So they put extra protection there so that when they were building the addition, they didn't disturb that dirt at all. And the human and skeletal remains and associated artifacts are curated at the Illinois State Museum in Springfield per the stipulations of the Human Skeletal Remains Protection Act. We were not able to identify any of the individuals, and we were not able to identify any next of kin. So why don't we know more? As I said,
we weren't around for
we weren't around. There's no firsthand account of this. And as I've said several times, we don't know what happened to the city cemetery records. You can make several guesses, like, did they, once it was converted to a park, did someone just throw them away because they didn't think they needed them anymore? Did they not keep good records to begin with? We don't know. We know that we can't find them. Undertaker records were found and transcribed starting in 2016. However, they start in 1872. And as far as we know, the last burial in the city cemetery was in 1876 or 86.
I want to say it was after I know it was after 1872. But depending on which record you look at, I think they were definitely done by 1880.
Yeah. So the Undertaker records aren't going to help us a whole lot, but they are available in local history and genealogy if you want to look at them.
Well, and the Undertaker records, what is fascinating about them is, yes, they'll say that somebody was buried in the city cemetery. That's all well and good. It doesn't tell us where in the city cemetery they were buried, just that they were to be buried in the city cemetery.
And then we don't know if they were then moved.
Yes.
Yeah. And
well, the ones we do know that were moved, we do know they were moved, but
we know if they were moved to Springdale. I don't know if we know every cemetery. So, and as Amber has said, some information is anecdotal rather than based on facts or evidence. It's, well, I know my uncle always told me that my third great grandmother was buried there, but we don't know. We don't have anything to back that up. I think I have one last fun thing here, the other Lincoln Park. So this is something we discovered in our research of Lincoln Park in Peoria, is that Lincoln Park in Chicago was once a city cemetery.
So this is not a thing that was strictly in Peoria. This happened in a lot of places.
Exactly. Yeah. So we discovered this, that Lincoln Park was a city cemetery, and they had the great misfortune of the Chicago fire, which made it even more difficult to know who is buried where. And there's this great website, which I put on this slide, hiddentruthstuff.northwestern.edu. This woman, Pamela Banos, is actually an artist. She's an art professor at Northwestern, or was in 2008 when she published this. And she did this project about the cemetery, and there's actually still a mausoleum in the southeast corner of Lincoln Park, where a man by the name of Ira Couch is still interred along with members of his family. And Chicago has had the same issues that we in Peoria have had, that anytime there's a construction project, you just never know what you're going to find, and you might run into something unfortunate. But now, after 1989, they also know that they have to be careful any project they do there. Also, interestingly, just south of North Avenue is the Gold Coast neighborhood. And while that wasn't the city cemetery, it was a Catholic cemetery where that residential neighborhood is now. And so people who want to do work in their backyards may come across some human remains and have some issues there. I also just yesterday learned of a park in San Francisco, where they used old tombstones to build a retaining wall. So Buena Vista Park in San Francisco, look that up if you're curious. So that brings us to the end of our presentation for today. We would love to answer any questions that anyone has.
If we can.
We tried to be as thorough as we could. So are there any questions from anyone? No. Okay, well, thank you very much for attending, for listening to all of our information. If you would like to learn any more about Lincoln Branch or the city cemetery, we have all of these reports in the local history and genealogy department. Yes, Jeff has commented that there were stones in a house nearby. So we tried to research this as much as we could to the best of our knowledge. It's kind of an urban legend how the stones got in the basement of this house. They were, I believe, headstones that had been piled in a corner of the cemetery. And it kind of seems from, again, urban legend, that the guy who was building the house asked his buddy, the alderman, if he could have them for the floor of his basement. And the alderman said, sure. And I don't remember what year it was. They tore the house down and found these headstones in the basement. All right. Well, thank you very much. You've been a very quiet audience, but thank you very much. And if you would like to know anything more, you can let us know, send us an email with questions or anything you'd like to do. All right. Thank you. Goodbye.